In addition, they know what students normally misunderstand, just misconceptions that students have. And I use a book in my math class that talks about misconceptions in math. Especially after you've taught a while, you will learn that they're going to have trouble with certain things. It's just common. One thing I remember from misconceptions is that for science is that students, it's been found that students think that the orbit around the Earth, let me think how it is. Anyway, they think it's an oval instead of a circle just because of the pictures that have been in books. So there's a lot of misconceptions, and the longer you teach, you'll know those, plus you can get a list of those common misconceptions. And also help students have more input into what they're learning so that they can customize the information, give them choices when possible, and they can make the information become relevant to them and customize the information and the problems for themselves. So give them some choices, usually helps, and accept responsibility for the student outcomes and see what you can do as you reflect on your practice to help that. And teach them how to cooperate. In a position, in any position, they're going to have to learn how to cooperate. And I read a statistic one time from James Dobson on Focus on the Family that more people are fired from their jobs because they can't get along with the people more than because they can't do the job. So that tells us that we need to teach students to cooperate. How does your coursework affect your competence? Teachers who have had relevant coursework in education and psychology are likely to be more competent and satisfied with their training than teachers who lack such coursework. And there's some statistics in our book that talk about that teachers who go through an education program like you are seem to be more confident in some areas than teachers who go through alternative coursework. Teachers who go through a teacher education program feel more competent in the area of integrating theory and practice, what we learn in theory, like in this class, and how does it play out in the classroom, and also in gradually leading more complex activities than the students who went through an alternative program. Seems that the students that went through a regular education program didn't feel as competent in motivating students, dealing with culturally diverse students or exceptional students, managing the classroom, and computer use. So this research really speaks to schools of education like ours that we need to teach more about motivating students and dealing with culturally diverse. Of course, we have the class in the exceptional learner, and then of course we have classroom management classes, and then also computer use, and I think our students are fairly adept at using the computer. This is not showing, let me see if a principal survey, principals, more than one, it really should be principals survey, found that 5 factors are associated with teacher ineffectiveness. And one of them is if teachers do not have good classroom management, they're not going to have good results. Their instruction will definitely be affected. And that is so very true that in the book, Those Who Can Teach, and I can't recall the authors right now, but I think you use it in Foundations or Intro. I think Foundations, that book, Ryan and Cooper, that's who the authors are. They say you can't teach school if you can't keep school. So classroom management is very, very important to having productive classroom. Also, they need to know how to implement a lesson, not only know the content, but know how to implement a lesson. They need to have a rapport with students. They can't be their friend, but they must be a professional, but they need to have something in common with the students that they can discuss, be interested in the students, have a rapport with the students so the students know that they care about them. and you can't have a very good lesson if you can't plan it. You're not going to implement it very well. So it's very important to plan lessons and then how to implement them. How do I put them into practice when I'm in the classroom? And then also one of the areas, a lack of subject matter knowledge, and that's increasing now, especially in South Carolina, even in elementary and early childhood. We're going to be subjected. We're going to need to take a test on content knowledge as well as teaching knowledge, which, like the secondary, already do that. So the nature and values of science. What happens if we scoot this a bit? This is talking about unsystematic observation, not doing it as a routine, like we talked about in reflection, and the strength of doing it systematically, observing what's going on. So some of the limitations of I can't even say it right now. Unsystematic, there we go, observations are, if we don't do it regularly, then we may have some wrong information or draw false conclusions because we don't think about what alternatives might have caused something, or in other factors that we might give too much importance. So if we're not observing all the time and reflecting, we might not think of everything that could be involved. And our book says that retaining students in a grade is an example of a practice that results from unsystematic observation, which they're totally against. I don't have a straight position on that. We did retain my older daughter in first grade. I hope it was the right decision, but I can't tell you that what is right or wrong. It's kind of for the individual student and what their issues are. And also, if you do it systematically, there's some strengths, and that approach is you take a representative sample of subjects, of students. A representative sample would be students that would be in most of the schools you're looking at, the same kind of students. And we're going to do this on our protocol. You're going to tell me what your sample of students is going to be, and you're going to try to control non-relevant variables. So if you were looking at 2 classes of students, then you would want them to be about the socioeconomic same level, maybe from a rural school to rural schools, and then try to control non-relevant variables, things that would affect it, things that are happening that really won't affect what you're looking at. When you're doing your protocol, you're going to find a characteristic of one of the theorists that you want to learn about and look for that characteristic in the school. So it might, some non-relevant variables might be there, that whether it might not make a difference if they are if they're what gender. That might not be important, but we are going to record that part. And you're more objective, not as subjective, if you observe systematically and reflect. And also, usually if it's systematic, you publish your procedures and your results, how you did this study. So scientific observation is much better if it is done systematically. And usually it'll be replicated by others. When I did my doctoral dissertation, I replicated not an exact study of my major professor, but using a lot of the same information, and I came up with the same results. So what are some complicating factors in the study of behavior and thought processes? Sometimes the focus of the research is limited, and so that's a problem. Like, some students may perform poorly because it may be the lack of study skills might be why they perform poorly, or maybe it's inattentiveness in class, maybe low interest, they're not really interested in this subject, poorly written textbooks, low motivation, they're not motivated to achieve, vaguely worded exam questions, and the complexity if they're higher order questions. So if we look at research and we only look at lack of study skills, that might not be the real reason that the students aren't performing well, because it could be some of these other things that we've listed here. It's hard to study each of these and at the same time and take all of them into consideration. Also, the complexity of teaching and learning. Education is one of the hardest sciences because there's sciences to study, because there's so many variables that we have. First of all, we're working with people, and all of these things above might be looked at, or it might be teacher ineffectiveness. It could be a lot of different things, and so it's really hard to study education because it involves not only the cognitive thinking but also the emotional side. If the students have a connection with you, it's going to make a difference. There's just a lot of things that affect it. And also what data they're going to look at and how you interpret it is very different on your background also. And so some people construct different meanings from the same data, and that also is called constructivism, which is another chapter in this text. And so when new findings come out in the research, then sometimes we revise the ideas, and so research is ever evolving. So good teaching is partly an art and partly a science. We'll discuss that here. It's an art because it involves emotions, motives, beliefs, and emotions, values, flexibility. All of those things are more of the art. But teaching is also a science because we use research that's been done, research findings. And I would like for you to read, I have page 11 in my hard copy book, but I was looking at my ebook, and it doesn't have the page number, but it's right under the heading, Good Teaching is Partly an Art and Partly a Science, and how a first-year teacher felt about how she had been prepared. So also depends a lot on flexibility. As a teacher, that is really an important characteristic, just a feel for doing the right thing, and how am I going to be presenting everything, or let the students discover what would be the best way to teach this. And everything we do, I think we make facial gestures, facial expressions that tell the students how we feel about certain content and how we feel about them. And also the flexibility to improvise when something is not going well. Then what can we do? Stop and reteach something, whatever we need to do. And teachers must be willing and resourceful so we can work around impediments that are going to hinder us, such as being interrupted with fire drills, different child getting sick in the classroom. How are you going to work around those? You're going to have to not fall apart when these things happen. And also there's some letters to a young teacher that Jonathan Kozol wrote, and those would be interesting for you to read. I'm not going to read them here. So, good teaching is partly an art and partly a science because we combine art and science of teaching. Research only shows us what has worked under particular conditions. Doesn't mean that it's going to work in your condition or in your classroom. And it cannot conclusively say what will work in a given situation because the circumstances are never the same. But it is better to look at research than just trying things and on like trial and error. At least someone has studied what works well, and you should try that in your situation and then maybe adjust it to fit your circumstances. So the artistic scholar strikes a balance between the art and science of teaching by using research findings because they might be applicable to a particular group of students at a particular point in time, and they might have to be adjusted. So what reflective teachers, we talked about this already. How do you become a reflective teacher? Reflective teachers possess an introspective orientation. What in the world does that mean? That means they look into their own mind and think about how things work, and they're what Gardner would call, at least partly, they must be intrapersonal. And as I've said before, you have to be open-minded and to try new things and look at what the research says and see if it fits with your classroom. Also willing to take responsibility for the decisions, how you decided to teach a lesson or deal with a certain happening in your class. And there's a section of your book that's called Suggestions for Teaching, and it gives you a lot of ideas that will go with, that will be helpful to you. And try these suggestions out in your teaching. Other people have used them and they've been successful. There's also, you can use journal entries from each chapter to help guide you to guide your observation notes of yourself and your students. And, excuse me, analyze the observation notes for strengths and weaknesses and trying to see what is really working. So teaching is a very, very complex enterprise, or you might call it a venture or a calling or an occupation. I hope it's going to be a ministry for you and that it will be fulfilling. And so after each teaching episode, think about or write down an assessment of how you did, and that can be a formative assessment of your students and a formative assessment of yourself, which means as you're learning, you are assessing how things are going when you reflect. So that's the end of this session. Hopefully it has been helpful for you to understand the chapter.